Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
I've always been fascinated by the great mystery of why some people excel in organizations and others don't. Why two employees who come from similar backgrounds might join an organization at the same time, at the same level, and have roughly the same level of performance over the first few years of their careers. Yet over time, one of the two starts getting more rapid promotions, more visible projects, plum assignments, and in what seems to be the blink of an eye, they're leading a large team and near the top rung of the ladder. And the other guy, that guy she went through new employee orientation with just a few short years ago, well, his career is stuck with new opportunities few and far between. How do some leaders excel and others flounder? How do some leverage power and authority while others seem to be always at war with it? How do the most effective leaders learn and apply what they're learning in ways that help them succeed in big ways? Today, my guest, Dr. Stephen Barden, is going to help us answer some of these questions using research from his new book. He's also going to give us some advice that will help us navigate organizational life a bit more effectively. So no matter where you are on your leadership journey, sit back, listen, and enjoy.
Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about better business results, stronger teams, more successful careers, and happier lives. Along the way, we hope to bust some biases, build some bridges, and have some fun. We're glad you're here. And now, our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
It's Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about what it takes to be a great leader and how to build great teams. And sometimes we'll talk about new ideas in the world of business and commerce and how leadership applies in these new contexts. I'm the author of the book, Mission First People Always, the definitive guide to balancing people and performance, and it's available on Amazon or wherever you buy your books online. I'm also a trainer, consultant, and coach focused on leader and team development. Let me remind you, as I always do, subscribe or follow, leave a review, and tell a friend about our podcast. I do the show because I sincerely want to help people lead better and get more done with and through others. I believe everyone I invite to be a guest on the show can add value to your leadership journey. And I like to showcase talented people who care deeply about healthy organizations and good leadership, just as I do. And today is no exception. My guest today is Dr. Stephen Barden. Stephen is a former top executive in the media, technology, and communications industries, serving as CEO or executive board level for much of his career. Later in life, he trained as an executive coach, mediator, and eventually earned a doctorate in leadership education. He has been in private practice since 2001, working across Europe and the United States. He's the author of the rigorously researched book, How Leaders Do Business with Their World, part of the Emerging Conversations in Leadership series by Routledge. And today, we'll be discussing some of the important insights from that book. Dr. Stephen Barden, welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Mike. That's really kind. Thank you very much for inviting me.
And Stephen, you are in Berlin today, so I always love to have guests from different parts of the world. You've got a great lifestyle, it sounds like, spending part of the year in Berlin, part of the year in the south of France. You're traveling throughout the world working with clients. So thanks for taking that time for me. I'm excited to have this conversation. I'm excited because you've written a new book called How Successful Leaders Do Business with Their World. And we're going to primarily talk about your book, but I know that most authors don't simply wake up one morning and say, I'm going to write a book. So I'm always interested in why you chose to write this book on this topic. What was the burning question you needed to answer? And who's the book for?
Well, the book, to give a bit of a backstory, was when I was in my last job as a CEO, I was fired, to be blunt, and basically I was fired, and the reason that was given it was that I had been a bully, so which was completely surprising to me, and we did reach a settlement which showed that I wasn't. But the point that I was then thinking to myself, Mike, was, okay, so why did they use that reason for firing me? Why didn't they use the fact that I was, that I wore green socks? Or why didn't they use the fact that I didn't, make them lots of money? Why did they use that? So what I did is I sat down and I wrote and I thought about my values and how they'd evolved over about a year. And the result of that is I went into coaching and started working with top leaders and board members to work with them. But the question that remained always in my mind was, how do top successful leaders, what is their experience of learning? Why do they make certain choices? What assumptions do they make when they go in? So I set out to do a doctoral research program, which I finished in my old age in about 2015, I suppose, 2014. And I interviewed a group of top military leaders, 2, 3, and 4-star generals, top academics from various parts of the world, and some corporate and institutional leaders. And I started asking them basically, what was it that how did they learn under fire? What were the assumptions they were making? But they kept on steering me towards their childhood. They kept on saying to me, when I was a child, this is this and this, and I suppose you can track it back to my childhood. And I thought, these people really want to talk about the links between them and their childhood. So we did this research program, and there was a huge amount of data that I gathered. And the result was that we came out with a model, if you like, a thesis that basically said that the way human beings manage their authority and their power, how they manage their world, their context, arises from the relationship or the foundational assumption they form when they are children about the power balance between themselves and their world. And the most successful leaders had a very balanced sense of this power equilibrium. So therefore, they were able to say to themselves and be able to have that confidence that said, you know what, I can do business with my world. I don't have to oppose it. I don't have to compete against it. I can do business with my world.
So Stephen, this is fascinating to me. What are some examples of conversations you had with these leaders where childhood experiences really affected them? I know in the very beginning part of your book, you tell a story, and I'm not sure if that story is a true story or whether it's one that you created to make a point. But the story in the first part of your book was about a child who didn't have, we might say, good parents. The mother was struggling with addiction, economically disadvantaged, not a lot of supervision, different boyfriends in this kid's life. Mother's boyfriends in the kid's life. But the kid was curious. He was courageous. He had the freedom to kind of move around and interact in his community, versus another child who had more of a traditional, upstanding sort of childhood. And that child approached the world very differently. First of all, were those stories true, or did you find stories like that when you interviewed the successful leaders?
No, these were all true stories. These were all true stories. Some of them were, if you like, two stories put together, but they were all true stories. There is a young man, exactly that, who his mother, in order to get over a hangover or whatever she was struggling with, would send him out of the house at the age of 4.5, and he would wander down to the beachfront and and get catch an ice cream or something off somebody for $5 or so. And there were certainly people like that. Those were true stories. So the reason that, if you like, the one who was sent out and survived and thrived was because their curiosity, their ability to explore the world was not, through the grace of God, was not actually circumscribed, squeezed, crushed by abuse or abandonment or fear. So that kid, whom I call Michael, was able to explore and carry on exploring, and it was able to form a relationship with the world where he eventually was able to say, okay, so that one doesn't want to give me an ice cream, fine. I'm not going to worry. I'll go and find somebody else to give me an ice cream. That person wants to get too close. Nope, don't want to do that. I'll move away. So was able to manage, through their exploration, through the fact that they were able to experience, and that's a key point, they were able to experience their world, and they were able then to learn to manage it. That's that type of person. The other one was a girl who was, in fact, brought up with a mother who again had addiction problems, but instead of letting her open up, was squeezed and was made frightened by the outside world, was being told that the outside world was a bad place to be. So she basically just turned inwards and did not experience the world, imagined the world, assumed the world was in fact the enemy. Michael, at the beginning, that first story, learned the assumption that the world was actually a partner. So became extremely curious about the world. The more curious he became about the world, the more he was able to do well in the world. And he's done particularly well in the world since then. And all these leaders, the top leaders that we interviewed as well, completely different from those two, those top leaders had also been able to experience the world and to learn how to manage it. And at the end of the book, I actually talk about, perhaps this can be also applied in some sort of way to children, that we need to be able to let children, while protecting them, to experience the world, to be curious about the world, to see that the world does not deliberately bring malicious problems to them, that they can handle problems, giving them the confidence to experience and manage and handle the problems. So that's what that was all about.
Stephen, you just used the word partnering, and I know in the book you write a lot about the importance of this partnering stance, the value of leaders partnering with the world rather than trying to impose themselves on it. So tell us more about what that looks like and the impact that a partnering approach has on the culture of organizations, the nature of someone's leadership. What's good about it?
We've been brought up, I think, with a myth, and particularly, I suppose, in the last 30, 40 years, particularly in corporate leadership, that leadership is, you lead from the front, you lead on your own, the loneliness at the top, all that bit. And, the leader has to make the decisions alone. These leaders, and what I continue to work in my coaching, these leaders worked in partnership. They saw themselves as almost the managing partner. Now, there is a logic to that stemming from my book and the thesis that we talked about, where they have a balanced equilibrium with the world. They know that their greatest resource is knowledge of the world. They know that their greatest resource are people around them. They also know that they cannot lead on their own. If they do, it's a total waste of resource for somebody to say, right, I'll make the decision. Don't you worry about it. You just feed me and I'll make the decision. That's a complete waste of resource. Whereas if you're then saying to the people around you, and you create a culture, by the way, that goes down the organization doing this, you say to the people around you, tell me what you think about this. Give me some idea. Let's talk about some ideas about where to take this forward. They all did this. They all scenario planned, particularly, by the way, the military. The military just were immensely good at gathering their officers around them and planning and thinking and what could go wrong, what could go right, what can we do, what have we missed out? It's that, it's almost that Steve Jobs things of, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? So the more resource they have around them, the brighter and the better they have around them, they know that the more the organization is going to go through. People who are in partnerships, and I certainly found this with the leaders that I use in my research and the successful leaders that I coach now and work with now, have actually surprisingly very small egos. They tend to be able to always look out and say, right, use the resource they have around them, immensely alert, Mike, to the context, the links in the organization. They tend to view their organizations as a mosaic almost, that everything links together. So they will be thinking text and context all the time. They will be thinking, okay, so I'm an organization that makes technology, but where is my market? Who are my buyers? Who are my sellers? What do I need to do to be able to widen my influence? So they keep on seeing potential impact all the time because they are so immensely alert to their world.
So I appreciate the recognition of this collaborative approach, and I think it's consistent with my own experience and what I believe about leadership. But I'm curious about where we started this conversation and your first statement around the genesis of this research was, why did they choose to give this reason for firing me? You're a bully. Were you not collaborative when you were leading, Stephen, or did this did these new findings sort of surprise you and become a wake-up call? What was the reflection there between your experience as a leader and what you learned from these leaders?
Very, very good question. I originally come out of the media business. So I was a manager, a senior manager in television and television technology and radio before that. So, and in the media business in those days, and I think it's probably still the same, it was very hierarchical. If I had been, as a reporter, had been told by my editor to jump, my only question would be how high. There was no arguing about it. And of course, I took that model, if you like, and I was seen as quite a mild leader, if you like, when I was in the media business. In that context, I took that model with me into a company which was not a media company, which was actually a company that we were trying to convert it from a white goods company into a technology company. But the people were still the same people who were doing white goods business. So they saw this business, the way I managed, as quite confrontational, and they expected a much more collegial way of doing it. So I had forgotten that context is as important as text. Leading a company A, does not mean that I should be using the same techniques, the same style, the same approach, the same relationships in leading a new company. So basically, I forgot to match context and text. That's basically what I was doing. And I think that's why, by the way, I find it so, in the 20 years that I've been coaching, that I find it so sad, I think is the word, where people will place shareholders or boards will place leaders into completely different companies without thinking, are they appropriate to this particular company? Are they appropriate to this particular style? So it's the agility of the leader that I didn't have that caused me to be vulnerable to be a bully or close to being a bully.
So, Stephen, let's step back to this major finding from your book, this idea that one's childhood experiences greatly influences their approach and philosophy of leadership later in life. And it's about how we learn and whether we are curious and engaging with the world, or we see the world as a fearful place. So what if I'm the young girl, or I'm the woman now who earlier in life had this experience where my mother told me the world was a scary place, be cautious, be fearful because you will get hurt. How does she overcome that 30 years later as a leader in her organization?
You're right, because in fact, she would now be putting that fear and that oppositional stance, as I put it, onto her own business. I think you have to be able to, what we do is once we've gone through an analysis, and that's what I do with all my clients now, I do a 3 to 4 hour interview in which we look at exactly where they are in terms of this navigational stance, this balance, if you like, in terms of power. And then once we've done that, and we mirror that back to the client, we're able to say, okay, so now do you see that was the child, it is not the adult. Now we start applying that in practice. So some of her habits will be directly visible, if you like, and you can directly link them to that childhood foundational assumption. And you're able to then say, well, you did that. This is why you're doing that. Why don't you let's try this way. Let's try being, when you next go into a meeting, instead of shutting people down, just encourage them to quote, encourage them to critique you, for example, or to critique your idea. And you start applying in bite-sized chunks a partnering sort of behavior. For example, I had a client who would literally shut down people because his way of asserting himself into the world was through his intellect and through his experience, through his intellect and the skill of his experience. So that when he went into meetings and chaired meetings, if anybody came up with an idea that remotely challenged him, his hackles would rise and he would shut them down completely. By doing that, he was actually stopping good ideas coming through. So what we did, as I said, try it this way. Let's try it this way. Just try taking in that critique and seeing if it is the threat that you think it is. So they would do that. First time it didn't particularly work because his irritation came to the fore. And then we do it again and we do it again until you're starting to put down new, what I call tram lines. You're actually putting down new tram lines so that even in a crisis, that person has put down new tracks and hopefully will not revert back to that authoritarian style because they then see the benefit. So you link it to the foundational stance, you get them to see the impact, you then move them on to trying an alternative way, get them to see the benefit of that, and then keep on doing it until they are actually in a new mode, if you like.
And Stephen, what drove that client to seek your assistance, to be open to working with an executive coach like you, to receive feedback from you? What was it that he wasn't getting the kind of results he was after? Was he in a career crisis sort of mode, or did he have some self realization that he needed help?
He had some self-realization that he needed help because he'd never been in that senior a position before. He'd been a chief executive of a smaller company, and now this was a big one, and he needed somebody to be able to take him out of. He could see the habits, if you like. And one of the things that the board had said to him, and when they asked me to look at, was making sure that his abrasiveness, if you like, did not close the company's debate and ideas and innovation. This was an innovative company. Once we'd got around the table, I mean, he was quite reluctant at the beginning, but once we got around the table, the first thing I noticed, and it reminded me of the leaders that I researched, was by approaching him in this way, by doing this in-depth interview, he saw recognition. that somebody recognized who he was. Somebody recognized what he was, how he was managing his world. And that created an immensely rich relationship, because he was somebody wanting to understand what was going on in his world and actually showing him what was going on in the world. And then the trust developed, and then we were able to do that. But the first point was when he and his board wanted him to develop a new, what they call style. They like the word style, but they did.
And how is this person doing now?
Well, he certainly transformed an organization that was pretty manufacturing, conservatively based, into a very innovative company that is moving into areas that they would never have dreamed of doing before. Much more flexible, much more open, lots of ideas bubbling into the organization, and has been doing so for 6 or 7 years now.
So we're talking with Dr. Stephen Barden about his book, How Successful Leaders Do Business with Their World. One of the, you used a term, Stephen, in passing, and I want to go back and make sure that I invite you to define this term, because I think it's a really important idea coming out of the book. And it's this idea about having a navigational approach to leadership. How would you simply define that term? And again, why is it important for us to understand it?
Leaders, I think, particularly, I was going to say particularly in this time, but no, in all times, need to be particularly flexible in their ability to be able to move their entire organization closer to its goals. So that, the image I'm thinking of is taking a ship or a plane and taking its passengers and its cargo through to its destination as much as possible. The important part about a leader is that the leader needs to have, when plotting the chart, needs to have plan A, plan B, plan C, and plan D. And needs to be, because what you thought was going to be able to work in your previous project, not necessarily going to work now because your competitors have caught up with you, or because that service is no longer needed. So the navigational thing is immensely fluid. And that comes from these leaders who I researched, who, because they were working so closely with their world, were immensely alert to all the routes and all the possibilities and all the linkages and all the hazards, if you like, that came across. So they literally were able to have plan A, plan B, plan C, and plan D. They all said that to me. They all said, look, whatever happens, if we find that a route we're going is not working, we will go into plan B. There's this thing that I talk about there in terms of, which is linked to the navigational, where they talked about doing the best possible until the possible is no longer best, and then you change the possible. So they will work towards everything they can do to do the best possible. And then, if necessary, if that is no longer the best, they will change the possible.
Stephen, I think we just found the quote of the episode. One of the things we do in promoting these shows is we find one quote coming out of the episode, and we put it out there in our promotional work. And say that again, so I make sure and get it. We do the best possible until
the possible is no longer best, and then you change the possible.
I love that. So if I am seeking to join an organization, and they're in a role that seems to fit me, but I'm trying to determine whether I fit within the culture of the organization, is there anything I can do as an outsider, considering an organization, to understand whether the leaders have this collaborative, collegial, nimble, agile, navigational approach what sorts of questions or what are the telltale signs that an organization is led that way that might make me want to join it? Or if it's not that kind of organization, where I might want to run from it?
And the assumption is that you're a collaborative, fluid, nimble leader yourself, right? That's what you're saying.
Yeah, I want to be part of that
Yeah.
kind of culture.
Yeah. So the first thing I think you need to do is sit in on meetings, if you can. If you can sit in on meetings, sit in on them and listen to how many of the ideas that come through are ideas that are not bottlenecked by the leader. See basically how much of a hierarchy there is in the organization. The first thing I do, and in fact, I used to do this for an executive search company, who hired me at one stage to do this sort of stuff, is find out who holds the influence. Who are the influencers within the organization? Are the influencers at the top of the hierarchy, or are they disseminated throughout the organization? And go and talk to the influencers, and they may be very junior. By the way, I remember having, when I took on a CEO job, I was quite determined to sort of clean up the place, and I was about to fire somebody who I thought was completely redundant. I thought, I don't know what this person is doing here. And the head of HR sidled up to me and said, "Stephen, don't do that. Don't do that, because that is your memory officer. That person is your memory officer. So go and find your memory officer," is what I'm saying here. Go and find the memory officer within that organization. Go and talk to people outside the leadership and just chat to them and see how relaxed and able they are to come up with new ideas, to think about what's going on. They'll also tell you how power is wielded in there. So apart from coming to me, Mike, and asking me to do an in-depth profile of you and the organization, I think those are the ways to do it. Don't look just to the leadership. Go and talk to people. Go and sit in, watch them. And a lot of the stuff that I found when looking at the temperature of organizations was just sitting in on conversations in the canteen, or sitting on meetings, and just listening, just seeing how much freedom, how much flexibility, how much nimbleness there was in the organization.
Yeah, the key being go in with eyes and ears open, and not necessarily just engage with the person that you're interviewing with.
Yeah.
Now, it strikes me that all the things that you've discovered in your research and we've been talking about today are terribly important if we are trying to create more diverse and inclusive organizations. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And especially now when we're talking about, stakeholder management, we're talking about ESGs, the environmental, social, governmental regulation that's coming more and more. I think that's entirely true. We need to be able to not only do the job in that narrow sense. We need to be able to actually look after and manage and think about all the stakeholders within the organization. And I think so that for me is diversity, so that you're able to be diverse in terms of the people you hire, whether by gender, whether by race, whether by whatever, because actually your society is diverse. So you need to be able to reflect your society in your organization. And I think you also need to think very clearly of what is going on in not only inside your organization, but what about your suppliers? What about your service suppliers? What are they doing? And how does that benefit or pose a threat to the way you're operating, so that you're creating this as large a community as possible, a cohesive community that is able to take your entire organization forward. So yes, the short answer is you're absolutely correct. It does promote, logically, I think, a much more diverse, much more inclusive, much more powerful organization community.
Well, Stephen, I warned you when we were talking prior to hitting record that the question that would come at the end of our conversation is what I believe to be one of the most important questions of every interview. And that's this: what's one thing that each of my listeners can begin doing right away, based on what you have learned through your research, your experience, what you're coaching your clients to do? What's one thing that they can do? Maybe it's a small thing that will make them a better leader right away.
I think the practical thing is, at your next meeting, ask them for their ideas and ask them to critique your idea. Ask them to say what is wrong and what is right with my idea, and reward them for the best critique.
That takes a bit of courage for the leader.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on the culture that's been created in that organization up to that point, it might take some courage on the part of the person in the room giving that feedback.
Yeah, that's it. And you can do that, by the way, by saying, it's not me you're critiquing, it's my idea. That's the important. Ray Dalio did that in his organization, and as far as I can tell, it was immensely successful. It's this thing of saying, you're not critiquing me. There is no ranking here. There's no hierarchy here. You're not critiquing me. You're critiquing an idea, and it is the idea that matters, because if the idea that I'm putting forward has got a flaw in it, it's better that you tell me than we discover than the market tells us.
I think that's
and
excellent.
Then reward them for, and then reward them for it.
That is excellent, excellent advice. You're not critiquing me, you're critiquing my idea, and it's better to figure it out in this room together than feel the impact or the implications that we might learn from the market if we didn't get it right in this room. So I love that. Stephen, you've been a great guest. I've enjoyed our conversation. Within the show notes, there is information on how the audience, my listeners, can contact and connect with you, Stephen, where to get a copy of your book. And I would encourage everyone to consider doing that. And I hope this conversation has caused you to think about how you engage your world, how curious you are, how eager you are to learn, and how open you are to learn from others. That's really the reason we do this podcast, is because we're curious, we want to learn, and we want to bring people to your attention that have something meaningful to say to us. And this conversation, this podcast, I believe has done that. So I hope it's inspired you. I hope it has intrigued you. And I hope it causes you to invite people to critique your ideas. I just love that. So until next time.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.